What is the most important message from this adaptation report you've just produced?
I think the clearest message is that adaptation is not optional. It is both an economic and development imperative. And the reason why I say this is because that climate change impacts are already reversing development gains in critical sectors that the continent relies on. So thinking through agriculture, for example, infrastructure, health, water. I mean, there's a very clear connecting tissue through these critical sectors. They are actually the lifeblood of the continent. And given that climate change is here, then, I mean, it's just imperative that we find interventions of countering it, of adjusting to these changes. And that's why I say that adaptation now becomes an economic and development imperative. I think critically, again, for governments is that locally driven, kind of adaptation interventions need to be well coordinated at all levels, right? Because then we have seen that these local adaptation efforts actually deliver measurable resilience benefits. However, they must be embedded in national planning and budgeting processes. The thinking around this is that adaptation basically must move from being treated as a project-based kind of environmental issue to being mainstreamed, into economic planning, I would say, into public finance, finance systems, and importantly, into sectoral policy. So that I think for me is the most important information from the report.
What are some of these locally led technologies you are referring to in your report?
So the report identifies, I think, 4 critical locally led kind of interventions which governments across the continent could embrace. One of them is climate smart agriculture and agroecological practices. However, this component needs to be integrated with traditional knowledge, and it must again be supplemented with improved forecasting and extension services. So that is one. And the reason is that, I mean, we are moving away from the conventional old age kind of farming into digital farming, into digital agriculture. So issues around precision agriculture, for example, improved kind of seed banking so that then the seeds are planted where they actually thrive, in the right soils, in the right climatic conditions. It's no longer shooting in the dark, So that is why climate smart agriculture becomes extremely important. The second one is early warning systems and anticipatory action, especially where meteorological data, I would say, is paired with what we call local response planning. I mean, that becomes extremely important. Thirdly, I'll talk about nature-based solutions, a critical component as well. So say issues around watershed restoration, issues around mangrove protection, which I think we have seen even in the study findings, reduce risks and create livelihoods for the people around there. And then finally, I will talk about decentralized water management and resilience infrastructure planning. And this is important because not just in the rural areas or peri-urban areas, but in the urban areas where climate change is actually ravaging, critical infrastructure components. And so for me, I think water being a very important element, and given that, by the way, that is the focus of the AU theme these years on water and sanitation, decentralized water management becomes a critical area where we will need key innovation models to ensure that water and sanitation is elevated, not just in regional and continental platforms, but in global platforms as well. So maybe just as a finalize on that question, I would say that what makes these models scalable, I think it's not just about the technical viability, if you asked me, I think it's that they have already demonstrated success across the continent in various contexts, and that, if they can be integrated into national development strategies, then we'll end up with very optimal results with minimal, if at all, institutional adjustment. So that is why I would say these four, for me, are extremely important.
What role, though, does the private sector have to play in climate adaptation in Africa?
Good question. So there is no way. I think there's no way you can leave out the private sector in climate action discussions. The private sector plays a critical role, and it's not even just the private sector alone. So there's private sector. We have civil society and other vulnerable groups. But now that you asked about the private sector, let me refocus on the private sector. Now you realize that the resources that the public institutions have, so say at national level, are not sufficient to manage adaptation interventions in the continent. In fact, countries in the continent have been utilizing resources meant for critical sectors, social sectors, for example, like health and education, to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So further, even creating more challenges with the communities in these specific countries. We have had inadequate resources. I think that is a fact. Of course, there are other challenges around resource management, but the point is that we do not have sufficient resources from the public coffers, and that is why the private sector comes in. Now, the private sector, as it were, are usually driven by profit margins. And I think that the innovation models are important for them because then there are margins in there. If you're talking about climate smart agriculture, clearly any economist will tell you that there are margins in there. If you're talking about models around renewable energy, utilizing the vast potential of solar energy in the continent, then there are margins in there. If you're talking about engaging our dividend, the youth population in the continent, these guys are techno-savvy big time. And certainly the private sector would really harness from them. So the idea is that we need, as a matter of policy, to engage the private sector at every other stage of climate action, whether it's adaptation or mitigation.
What are some of the key policy changes that will be needed to actually achieve some of these recommendations you've lined out in this report?
Yeah, so just briefly, I think what I would quickly say in a nutshell is that the continent of Africa, as it were, has proven adaptation solutions or rather interventions. The challenge, as it were, is aligning finance, is aligning policy, is aligning inclusion to scale what works. Now, talking about inclusion, I think for me that component is extremely important because we've always talked about inclusion tokenistically. So issues around gender, youth, indigenous people, and civil society, we do not just have to be talking about engaging these groups at the consultation level. I think for me, what is critical here is that participation must influence budgets. It must influence authority. So we need to have direct representation of indigenous communities, of youth, of gender, of civil society in adaptation decision-making bodies and spaces. We have always claimed to be, integrating these voices, but by and large, you realize that in critical spaces, in critical declarations and commitments, the voices of the youth, of women, of indigenous people, of civil society don't really feature in there. So for me, that is a very critical policy issue that we must be deliberate about, that nothing seems to be working, nothing can work for the people if they're not part of that decision making in the first place. Because I mean, adaptation, mitigation, resilience building needs to be contextually relevant. And if that has to happen, then there has to be direct participation of these groups in adaptation, spaces in mitigation, spaces in resilience building spaces. Then the other component, which I think that we need to do very critically, is that we need to disaggregate monitoring data, right? So that then we track who actually benefits from climate finance funding, from adaptation funding, from mitigation funding, from resilience building funding. Because by doing that, then we're able to then say, okay, fine, I think the resources came in and they went to the right people, all right? Then thirdly, I think the other important point is that we need to recognize indigenous knowledge, at least from that study, as technical expertise and not just as an informal add-on as we've always done. Because indigenous knowledge, as it were, plays a critical role, where science doesn't exist. And so for me, indigenous knowledge is technical expertise by all standards, by definition, all right? So the bottom line is that we have what works. We have already seen what is working in the continent. We need to align policy, align finance, align inclusion. Then we will be able to scale these interventions across the continent.
Manuel, I cannot let you go without asking you why it was necessary for you to put out this report. Why now?
Good question. So we have had this discussion around adaptation. Let me speak to adaptation because that is what the report really talks about. Adaptation for the longest. But the point is, I mean, why haven't we been realizing optimal results, even though national governments have been putting money into adaptation interventions? In Kenya, for example, we have had the FLOCA, right? And it's a fantastic intervention. So the point is, why aren't we realizing optimal results from these interventions? So this study was motivated by the fact that we needed to unravel what works for the continent. Could it be that we have been pumping money in interventions that don't necessarily work for the continent? Have we been pumping money in copy-paste kind of interventions? So the study was motivated by that particular point, that we wanted to find out which adaptation interventions work for this continent. As I've said, climate action needs to be contextually relevant, even though it requires global, kind of effort to manage it. But the interventions must be contextually relevant. So for us, we thought, okay, fine. So we have development partners coming in. We have the international community coming in to bring resources. But if they bring the resources today in this continent, or say in my country, Kenya, for example, if I were to be biased, and then we are saying, listen, we have $1 billion US, can you ensure that this money goes to climate action, to adaptation, for example? So where will the government be putting that money? So we don't want to, as I said earlier, to be shooting in the dark. So the report was motivated by the fact that we wanted to be very precise, very accurate in terms of where do we want to put adaptation money, what works, what will work if we are to scale, so that then communities start realizing the benefits of these resources to adaptation.